He said the highway of death was a war crime? Let me see. Let's see here. What is he talking about? This was an American war crime on retreating forces and civilians called Highway of Death, where A-6 intruder jets bombed the front of the vehicle column to cause a pileup, boxing in thousands of cars. They kept bombing for 10 hours straight. You Polish government funded fascist freaks. Now, look, I disagree with Hasan on many things. Going after Visegrad, you know, I think I'll give Hasan some critical support for fighting with Visegrad. I'm not a huge fan, to be quite blunt. I don't like a lot of their commentary around migration and around refugees and stuff. But putting that to the side, putting my ability to critically support Hasan against this Twitter account, when he says civilians, I think the way he paints it here makes it sound like it was just kind of you know, like a line of like just civilian cars full of civilians, and you know, there were some soldiers in there. But if you talk to reporters who were there, I think there's only one account that suggests that they saw a civilian body. All of these vehicles, or the vast majority of these vehicles that you see that are civilian, were commandeered by the Iraqi army as they were retreating from Kuwait. For those of you who don't know about the Highway, I feel like I should at least give you guys a rundown of the Highway of Death. So on February 26th, Schwarzkopf, who was like the head of our head of our forces during the Kuwait War, he led us to victory, so to speak. On the 26th, there was a Iraqi army that was retreating out of Kuwait. They had gotten slapped around. They decided on January 15th that they weren't going to abide by UN Resolution 660, which was calling for their removal of the country, for them to leave the country by January 15th. That was their deadline. They did not. And so the American government and the coalition, along with a UN Security Council endorsement and a UN endorsement, went in, removed Saddam's forces, and by the end of February, he was retreating. So Saddam's army got in tanks, got in their vehicles, and commandeered a bunch of civilian vehicles and started retreating along two highways. I forget the name of the highways. There's like Highway 10 and Highway 8, I think. No, one second. Highway of Death. It was Highway 80 and Highway 8. Okay, so I had Highway 8, but it wasn't Highway 10, it was Highway 80. So they went along these two ways. Now, it's also alleged, or it's believed that along with the soldiers that were retreating that had to commandeer civilian vehicles and tanks and armored vehicles, there were also collaborators that were retreating because, you know, they were fearful that when the Kuwaitis come back, they're not going to be too happy to deal with all these people who worked with the Iraqi army, which committed war crimes and atrocities while within Kuwait. So they didn't want to, you know, get the Kuwaiti government treatment for somebody who betrayed the nation. At least that's the idea. There was also a lot of PLO people who went along as well. But as far as I know, we didn't get any photographs or pictures that displayed dead civilians. So when he says bomb civilians, while we have reason to believe that there were civilians in the convoy, either PLO, a collaborator, or otherwise, we don't have, I think, really any decisive information that we killed like a bunch of civilians during this raid. We destroyed a lot of vehicles. We destroyed a lot of tanks. We destroyed a lot of armored cars. We killed a lot of soldiers. But the idea that this is a war crime, that's just not true. I mean, I don't think under any definition of war crime that you could try to manifest that is normalized on the international stage would this be considered a war crime. Firing at retreating forces, as long as there has not been a negotiated like ceasefire or something along those lines, is not a war crime. People fire upon retreating forces all the time. When the Ukrainians had to retreat, the Russians fired upon them. When the Russians retreat, the Ukrainians fire upon them, due to the fear of them regrouping and then attacking in the future. Now, this isn't a war crime, but that doesn't mean you think necessarily it's morally permissible or okay or good. Something can not be a war crime and you can also still disagree with it. See, this happened on February 26th. 2 days later, The government of, and sometimes this is, people kind of spread around misinfo about this. People will say, hey, they were abiding with UN Resolution 660 and leaving Kuwait. Why would you fire upon them as they're abiding by Resolution 660? That's dishonest. Because Resolution 660 said they had to leave the country by January 15th. They then did not leave the country and then were removed. And as they're being removed, they retreated and were fired upon. That's very different than them coming out and abiding by a UN resolution and being fired on during that. That was us forcing them to abide by the UN resolution, them leaving because they were being forced to, and us firing upon them. These are two very different things. It was 2 days after February 26th, on February 28th, that there was an actual negotiated ceasefire type settlement where the Iraqi army was like, fine, we're leaving, we quit. And I think it only got finalized in March, early March, I believe. Point is, it's not a war crime. Now, that doesn't mean that it's moral. That doesn't mean that it's good. You could still say, and I understand this logic at least, that it was February 26th. The Iraqi army was smashed. They were not going to be able to take back Kuwait. We knew at that point that the Iraqi army was probably on their way out of the country. We could all, I mean, they're leaving on Highway 8 and Highway 80 for a reason, because they saw the writing on the wall. So what's the purpose of blowing up all these people and killing all these soldiers who are actively retreating from Kuwait, no matter if they're carrying loot with them or you know, have stolen from the local Kuwaiti population? Is killing all these people really worth it if it doesn't make Kuwait necessarily immediately safer? You could make that argument. Now, Schwarzkopf and others would argue that, number one, not only is it within bounds of international law to attack a retreating army, but two, that the purpose of attacking a retreating army is to stop them from recruiting and attacking again. So the pitch would be, okay, I understand your point, but we want to take out the Iraqi tanks, we want to take out the Iraqi armored vehicles and stop them from taking as much military capacity that they used for invasions, stopping them from doing that again. And the only surefire way you can 100% guarantee that they won't do it again with these tanks is to blow up the tanks. And so that was the argument of the coalition forces and of Schwarzkopf and others as to why they went after the tanks. That's what people who are in favor of it argue. In favor. Now, see, there's a real debate you could have there. There's a real argument where it's like, this wasn't necessary. It was completely over the line. We had already won the war. See, there's an argument you can have here, but this is very different than declaring the highway of death a war crime. Was it brutal? Absolutely. Did we kill a lot of people? Absolutely. You can just look at that highway and you can tell we busted up a lot of folks. Even though most on the ground after the fact reports seem to indicate that the majority of these vehicles didn't have bodies in them, that they were of course abandoned. But still, you can call this brutal, you can call it savage, you can call it wrong, but you can't call it a war crime. I've seen like some people try to do it, but it's very roundabout. Like, you got to go around. Also, can I just throw out there, and this is something that's been baffling me when I'm thinking about Hasan's commentary on what is and isn't a war crime, because Hasan's very bad at identifying war crimes. I don't think he knows anything really about, like, and okay, I shouldn't say anything about international law, but I don't think when he uses the word war crime, it doesn't sound like he's using it in an international law context. It just kind of sounds like, it feels like he only uses it to mean that's bad. That's a bad thing and I don't like it, therefore it's a war crime. Great example would be the Kerch Bridge explosion. I don't even think you should be against that necessarily. Attacking the Kerch Bridge, but he called that a war crime. Even though the Kerch Bridge was illegally built in Ukrainian-occupied territory, it's a major vein for the Russian logistical hubs and the Russian logistics down south. In fact, I would say it's the most important vein for Russian logistics down south, transporting tanks, guns, bullets, shells, armored vehicles, soldiers, all sorts of stuff, supplies, basic grenades, whatever is necessary for them to do the invasion. And again, was built illegally in occupied territory. And when did the Ukrainians strike it? In the middle of the night, when civilian travel across the bridge would be least likely, at least during the first strikes. Now, my question is, why is that a war crime when the vast majority, I said vast majority as if it's a debate, all military historians and international law scholars would say that, logistics lines and bridges that are used to transport goods and for the military are legitimate military targets, as long as the benefit to the military is proportional. This is why we always have the discussion about proportionality with Israel and Gaza. And you could easily make the argument that strikes on the Kerch Bridge are militarily beneficial to the Ukrainians. Zelensky has said that the centerpiece of his strategy for victory and liberation is isolating Crimea. But the only reason I'm talking about this is I don't understand how that is a war crime, but blind firing at commercial shipping that could be headed to Israel, could not be headed to Israel, could be owned by the Israelis, could not be owned by the Israelis, could be completely unrelated, could be related in some tangential way, just blind firing. How is it that striking the Kerch Bridge is a war crime, but blind firing at civilian vessels with civilian crews, not even transporting goods to Israel, the nation state in question, if you're trying to enforce a blockade, how is that not a war crime? I mean, in this case, you're talking about a military force that is retreating back into the country, which engaged in the aggression against Kuwait. You can explain the military usefulness for firing upon the highway of death when it comes to undermining Saddam Hussein's hard power. You can make that claim very easily. You can assert how it's useful in undermining Saddam very easily, and undermining his leverage, undermining his military capability. You can still argue against it, but you can make that argument pretty easily. How do you argue that about the Pluto transporting Saudi oil to India with a Vietnamese Indian crew? It would be one thing if it was just legitimately going after targets in Israel, but or just going after ships that were heading to Israel, transporting like military goods or transport stuff. But it's just, I don't get it. I don't understand Hasan's reasoning here. I don't understand how he gets to the conclusion that blind firing civilian ships, not war crime, blowing up Kerch Bridge, war crime, shooting retreating army, war crime, shooting at civilian vessels, unrelated to the conflict, not war crime. Okay, just... It's the law of neutrality, by the way, for those of you curious of why it's illegal to shoot on like unrelated commercial civilian vesting. It's the law of neutrality.